My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm a 32-year-old graphic designer living in Columbus, Ohio. 3 days ago, I got the call that shattered my world. My father, Robert Thompson, had collapsed at work from a massive heart attack. He was gone before the ambulance even arrived. But standing here in the parking lot of Peaceful Rest Funeral Home, watching my own mother slam the front door in my face while my sister Jessica smirked behind her, I realized that losing my dad wasn't going to be the most painful part of this week. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The most painful part was discovering that to my family, I had been dead to them long before he ever was. "You don't belong here, Sarah," my mother Linda had hissed through the crack in the door, her face twisted with a bitterness that seemed to have aged her years in just 3 days. "This is for family only. Real family, not for people who think they're too good for where they came from." Behind her, I could see the familiar faces of our small town gathering inside, all of them avoiding eye contact with me through the windows. These were people who had watched me grow up, who had cheered when I graduated valedictorian from Riverside High, who had once been proud to know Bob Thompson's smart daughter. Now they looked at me like I was a stranger, an intruder at my own father's funeral. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly understand, was that my husband David was standing right behind me. And David, my quiet, patient history teacher husband, who rarely raised his voice above a classroom whisper, was about to do something that would change everything they thought they knew about our family, about my father, and about the last 2 years of secrets that were about to explode into the open like a bomb going off in their perfect little narrative of rejection. The autumn rain had been falling steadily all morning, turning the fallen leaves in the funeral home parking lot into a slippery carpet of gold and red. I stood there in my black dress, the one I had bought specifically for this day, feeling the dampness seep through my coat as I stared at the building where my father lay waiting for his final goodbye. David's hand found mine, his fingers warm and steady against my cold skin, and I drew strength from his presence, even as my heart hammered against my ribs with a mixture of grief and rage. The drive from Columbus to Riverside had taken 2 hours. 2 hours of winding through Ohio farmland and small towns that looked frozen in time. David had driven in comfortable silence, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my shoulder when he saw tears sliding down my cheeks. We had talked about this moment, prepared for it even, knowing that my return to Riverside would be complicated. But nothing could have prepared me for the venom in my mother's voice or the satisfaction in Jessica's eyes as they turned me away from my own father's funeral. Riverside, Ohio, population 8,000, was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, where the biggest excitement was usually the annual corn festival, and where leaving for college was seen as either the greatest achievement or the ultimate betrayal, depending on whether you ever came back. I had left 12 years ago with a full scholarship to Ohio State, promising my parents I would return every holiday, every summer break. I had kept that promise for exactly 2 years, until the visits became strained, until the conversations became interrogations, until it became clear that my education was building a wall between me and the family I loved. The funeral home sat on Maple Street, right across from Miller's Diner, where my dad had eaten lunch every single day for 23 years. Through the rain-streaked windows of the diner, I could see the usual crowd of factory workers and retirees, all of them probably talking about the Thompson family drama playing out in the parking lot across the street. Mrs. Henderson from the corner house was definitely watching from her front porch, probably already planning how she would tell this story to the ladies at St. Mary's Church on Sunday. My mother had always been concerned about appearances, about what people would think, but losing Dad seemed to have pushed her over an edge I didn't know existed. When I had called 3 days ago to ask about funeral arrangements, her voice had been cold, mechanical. "The service is Thursday at 2, she had said. "I suppose you'll want to come." Not an invitation, not a shared moment of grief, just a grudging acknowledgement that I might show up. When I asked if there was anything I could do to help, anything I could bring, she had hung up on me. Jessica had been the one to call back an hour later, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Mom's just upset, you know how she gets. But Sarah, maybe it would be better if you didn't come. You know how people talk in this town. And with everything that's happened, with how you just disappeared from Dad's life these last couple years, well, it might just make things harder for everyone." The implication was clear. I was the problem. I was the one who had abandoned the family, and my presence at the funeral would only remind everyone of my failures as a daughter. But here's what Jessica didn't know, what none of them knew. My disappearance from family gatherings hadn't been by choice. It had started 2 years ago at Easter dinner, when my mother had spent the entire meal making pointed comments about how some people thought they were too good for their raising, how education sometimes made people forget where they came from. Jessica had joined in, asking loud questions about whether David and I were ever planning to have children, or if we were too busy with our fancy careers to think about family. The comments had gotten more pointed, more personal, until David had quietly suggested we leave early. The breaking point had come last Christmas, when I had arrived at the house on Oak Avenue with presents for everyone, excited to share the news that my graphic design business was finally taking off, that I had landed a major client that would change everything for us financially. Instead of celebration, I was met with eye rolls and dismissive comments about how I was probably making more money than my dad, how that must make me feel pretty superior. When I tried to give my mother the expensive perfume I had bought her, she had looked at it like it was contaminated. "I don't need charity from my daughter," she had said. "Your father and I do just fine without fancy gifts from people who think money can replace actually being here." That night I had cried in the guest bedroom while David held me, his quiet rage on my behalf more comforting than any words could have been. The next morning I had tried one more time to bridge the gap, suggesting, "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Maybe I could help Jessica with her real estate marketing, offering to design some flyers for her at no charge. Her response had been swift and brutal. "I don't need your help, Sarah. I've been doing just fine without my big sister's pity projects. Maybe instead of trying to fix everyone else's problems, you should focus on fixing whatever's wrong with you that makes you think you're better than the rest of us." After that visit, the calls home had become less frequent. The invitations had stopped coming, and eventually, the silence had stretched so long that it felt impossible to break. I had told myself it was temporary, that grief and hurt feelings would eventually heal, that my family would come around. I had no idea that during those 2 years of silence, my father had been quietly, secretly, reaching out in his own way. Standing in that parking lot, feeling the weight of my family's rejection pressing down on me like the gray October sky, I looked up at David and saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. It wasn't just anger, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't just protective love, though I could feel that radiating from him like heat. There was something else, something that looked almost like anticipation, like he was waiting for exactly this moment. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos of emotions I knew must be swirling inside him. "I need to tell you something. Something your dad asked me to keep secret until after the funeral. But seeing them treat you like this, seeing them try to keep you away from saying goodbye to the man who loved you more than anything in this world, I can't wait another minute." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope, thick with papers and worn from handling. "Your dad didn't abandon you, honey. He never stopped believing in you, never stopped being proud of you. And he made sure that everyone in this town, everyone in that funeral home, would know exactly how he felt about his daughter, who had the courage to build a better life." The envelope felt heavy in my hands, heavier than paper should feel, weighted with secrets and love, and 2 years of my father's hidden efforts to bridge a gap I didn't even know he was trying to cross. David's eyes were bright with unshed tears as he watched me stare at my father's handwriting on the front of the envelope. "Sarah Marie Thompson Mitchell," it read, in the careful block letters my dad had always used for important documents. "He started writing to me 6 months after that last Christmas," David continued, his voice barely audible over the sound of rain on the funeral home roof. "He was worried about you, about how much that fight had hurt you. He wanted to fix things, but he didn't know how. So he asked me to help him find a way." Inside the funeral home, I could see the crowd beginning to gather for the service. My mother was directing people to their seats with the efficiency of a woman who had been planning this day in her head for months. Jessica was greeting guests, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of someone who had always been the favored daughter. Michael was slumped in a chair near the back, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was probably borrowed for the occasion. None of them looked toward the windows. None of them seemed to care that I was still standing outside in the rain. But Frank Rodriguez, my dad's best friend from the factory, was looking. He was standing near the back of the room, and when our eyes met through the glass, he gave me a small nod, almost like he was waiting for something, like he knew something was about to happen. David saw me notice Frank and smiled, the first real smile I had seen from him since we got the call about Dad's death. "Frank's been helping us," he said. "He's been helping your dad plan this for almost 2 years. Sarah, your father spent every lunch break at Miller's Diner writing letters he never sent, planning ways to show you how much he loved you, how proud he was of everything you had accomplished. He never stopped believing that someday his family would see what he saw when he looked at you." The envelope in my hands seemed to pulse with warmth, as if my father's love was somehow still alive inside those pages. But even as hope began to bloom in my chest, the reality of our situation pressed down on me. My mother had made it clear that I wasn't welcome, and nothing in this envelope was going to change the fact that half the town was watching this family drama play out in the parking lot of Peaceful Rest Funeral Home. "David," I said, my voice shaking with exhaustion and grief and the terrible weight of 2 years of silence and misunderstanding. "Even if Dad wanted me here, even if he left me something in here, it doesn't matter now. They're not going to let me in. They're not going to let me say goodbye." That's when my husband, my quiet, gentle, patient husband, who had never in 7 years of marriage raised his voice in anger, who had never made a scene or demanded attention or forced a confrontation, looked at me with eyes that were suddenly blazing with determination and love, and something that looked almost like anticipation. "Sarah," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority I had never heard before, "you're about to find out that your father thought of everything. And in about 5 minutes, every single person in that funeral home is going to understand exactly why Bob Thompson was so proud of his daughter, and exactly what kind of man he really was." He took the envelope from my hands, not to take it away from me, but to open it himself, to show me what my father had been planning for 2 long years. As he unfolded the first document, his smile grew wider, and I could see Frank Rodriguez inside the funeral home, checking his watch and moving toward the front of the room. "Your dad was a factory worker, Sarah, but he was also one of the smartest men I ever met. And he knew that sometimes the only way to fix a broken family is to show them the truth so clearly, so publicly, that they can't ignore it anymore." The first document was a letter, written in my father's careful handwriting, addressed to the entire congregation of what was about to become the most memorable funeral service in Riverside's history. The second document was a legal paper that made my hands shake as I read it. And the third document was a bank statement that changed everything I thought I knew about my father's final years. As David helped me read through my father's last gift to me, I began to understand that this funeral wasn't going to be about my family keeping me away from saying goodbye. It was going to be about my father making sure that everyone in our small town understood exactly who his daughter really was, and exactly how much he had sacrificed to make sure I never had to apologize for becoming everything he had dreamed I could be. The rain was still falling, but somehow, standing there in that parking lot with my father's love letter to me clutched in my hands and my husband's arm around my shoulders, I felt warmer than I had in 2 years. Because I was about to learn that love doesn't always look like approval, and sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give their child is the freedom to become who they were meant to be, even if it means letting them go. Inside the funeral home, Frank Rodriguez was walking to the front of the room, carrying an envelope that matched the one in my hands. The service was about to begin, and my father, who had been planning this moment for 2 years, was about to have the last word in the argument that had torn our family apart. David squeezed my hand and looked toward the funeral home entrance. "Are you ready to go say goodbye to your dad, Sarah? Because I promise you, after the next hour, no one in this town will ever question whether you belonged in that room." The silence that followed Pastor Williams' prayer was broken not by the usual shuffle of people preparing to leave, but by the sharp sound of my mother's heels clicking against the funeral home floor as she stood abruptly from her front row seat. Linda Thompson had always been a woman who commanded attention when she wanted it, and the look on her face as she turned to face the assembled crowd made it clear that she had no intention of letting Frank Rodriguez's revelations be the final words spoken at her husband's funeral. "I think," she announced, her voice carrying the kind of forced composure that barely contained a storm of rage, that some things need to be clarified before people start drawing the wrong conclusions about this family. The room, which had been buzzing with quiet conversations about the trust fund and my father's letters, fell silent again. Every eye turned toward my mother, and I could feel the collective intake of breath as people realized they were about to witness something far more dramatic than anyone had expected when they arrived at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home that morning. Jessica rose to stand beside our mother, her perfectly styled hair and designer dress making her look like she was posing for a magazine photo, even in this moment of family crisis. But there was something desperate in her eyes, something that suggested she understood that everything she had built her identity around was suddenly shifting beneath her feet. "My sister," Jessica said, her voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room, "has always been very good at making herself look like the victim. She's always been skilled at twisting situations to make other people look bad while she comes out looking like a saint." David's hand tightened on my shoulder, and I could feel the tension radiating from his body as he prepared to defend me. But before he could speak, Frank Rodriguez stood up again, the manila envelope still in his hands. "Mrs. Thompson," Frank said quietly, "I don't think you want to go down this road. Not here. Not now. Not with what I still have to share." The warning in his voice was unmistakable. But my mother was beyond caring about warnings. Years of resentment and jealousy and carefully nursed grievances were finally finding their voice. And the public setting only seemed to fuel her determination to have her say. "Oh, I think this is exactly the right time and place," she shot back. "Since my husband apparently decided to air our family's private business in front of the entire town, I think everyone deserves to hear the whole truth. Not just the version that makes Sarah look perfect, and the rest of us look like monsters." She turned to face me directly, her eyes blazing with an anger that had been building for far longer than 2 years. "You want to know why you weren't welcome at family gatherings? You want to know why things became uncomfortable when you came home? It wasn't because we were jealous of your success, Sarah. It was because you made it impossible to have a normal family conversation without everything becoming about how much better your life was than ours." The accusation hit me like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because it revealed how completely my mother had rewritten history in her own mind. In her version of events, I was the one who had created the tension, the one who had made family gatherings uncomfortable by simply existing as someone who had built a different kind of life. "Every time you came home," she continued, her voice growing stronger and more accusatory, "it was like you were conducting an inspection, looking around at our house, our furniture, our lives, and finding them lacking. You never said anything directly, but we could see it in your eyes. The judgment. The pity. The way you looked at Michael when he was struggling to find work, like he was some kind of failure because he didn't have a college degree." Michael, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, suddenly looked up with an expression of surprise and discomfort. It was clear that he had never asked to be used as ammunition in this battle, and equally clear that my mother's version of his struggles wasn't something he entirely agreed with. "Mom," he said quietly, "that's not exactly how I remember it." But Linda Thompson was not interested in her son's perspective at that moment. She was on a roll, finally getting to say all the things she had been thinking for years, and the fact that she was saying them at her husband's funeral in front of half the town only seemed to add fuel to her fire. "And then there was the money," she continued, turning back to face the crowd. "Oh yes, let's talk about the money that Bob supposedly saved all by himself to create this wonderful trust fund. Do you know where that money really came from? It came from the household budget. It came from the grocery money, the utility money, the small savings we had put aside for home repairs. While I was clipping coupons and buying generic brands and wearing the same 3 dresses to church for 2 years, Bob was secretly funneling money out of our joint accounts to fund his guilt project." The room was completely silent now, the kind of silence that happens when people are witnessing something so raw and painful that they don't know where to look. I could see faces in the crowd reflecting a mixture of embarrassment, fascination, and growing discomfort as my mother continued her public dismantling of what everyone had just heard about my father's sacrifice. "He never asked me," she said, her voice beginning to crack with emotion. "He never discussed it with me. He just decided, all on his own, that proving his love for Sarah was more important than paying for the roof repair we desperately needed, or replacing the washing machine that had been breaking down for months. He chose her over his own wife, over his own household, over the family that was actually here, actually present, actually trying to maintain some kind of normal life together. Jessica nodded vigorously beside her, clearly emboldened by her mother's willingness to fight back against the narrative that Frank's letter had established. "Exactly," she said. "And now we're supposed to applaud him for bankrupting the family household to make some grand gesture for the daughter who couldn't be bothered to visit? We're supposed to think this is romantic and beautiful instead of irresponsible and hurtful?" The crowd was beginning to shift uncomfortably in their seats. What had started as a touching tribute to a father's love was rapidly becoming a public airing of family grievances that made everyone present feel like unwilling voyeurs to a private breakdown. But David had heard enough. My husband, who had spent 7 years trying to navigate the complicated dynamics of my family with patience and diplomacy, who had endured countless subtle insults and dismissive comments without ever losing his temper, finally reached his breaking point. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, rising from his seat and speaking in a voice that was calm but carried an underlying steel that made everyone in the room pay attention. "I think you need to stop talking now." The directness of it, the quiet authority in his tone, seemed to surprise my mother into momentary silence. David had never spoken to her with anything other than polite deference, had never challenged her or contradicted her, had always maintained the role of the respectful son-in-law even when she made it clear that his presence in the family was merely tolerated. "You want to talk about the whole truth?" David continued, his voice growing stronger. "You want to make sure everyone understands what really happened in this family? Then let's talk about the whole truth." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind journalists use for interviews. The sight of it sent a visible ripple of shock through my mother and Jessica, both of whom suddenly looked far less confident about their decision to air the family's private business in public. "Your husband asked me to document our conversations," David explained to the room at large. "He wanted to make sure that if anything happened to him before he could finish setting up the trust, there would be a record of his intentions and his feelings about the family situation. He was very specific about wanting everything recorded, because he said he had learned not to trust people's memories when it came to important conversations." David held up the recorder so everyone could see it. "I have 18 months' worth of recordings. Conversations where Bob talked about his heartbreak over the way Sarah was being treated at family gatherings. Conversations where he described specific incidents, specific comments, specific moments when his wife and daughter Jessica made it clear that Sarah's success was unwelcome, and her presence was an inconvenience." The color was draining from my mother's face, and Jessica looked like she was about to be sick. The confidence they had shown just moments before was evaporating as they realized that their version of events might not be the only one with documentation to support it. "Should I play some of those recordings now?" David asked, his finger hovering over the play button. "Should everyone here get to hear Bob describe the Christmas dinner where Sarah tried to share news about landing a major client, only to be told that some people don't know when to stop bragging? Should they hear him talk about the Easter gathering where Sarah offered to help Jessica with her real estate marketing, and Jessica responded by saying she didn't need pity projects from her sister?" Frank Rodriguez was nodding grimly, clearly aware of the recordings and their contents. "Bob played me some of those conversations," he said to the room. "That's how I knew he wasn't exaggerating about what was happening. That's how I knew the trust fund wasn't just about guilt or favoritism. It was about a father trying to find a way to show his daughter that someone in the family still believed in her." David clicked the play button, and suddenly my father's voice filled the room, tinny through the small speaker but unmistakably his. The recording was obviously from one of their planning sessions, probably in David's car or somewhere private where they could talk without being overheard. "I don't know how to fix this, David," my father's voice said, and the pain in it was evident to everyone listening. "I love my wife, I love all my children, but I can't stand watching what's happening to Sarah. Every time she comes home, it's like they're trying to punish her for being successful. Like they want her to apologize for making something of herself." David let the recording play for another few seconds, long enough for everyone to hear my father's anguish before clicking it off. The impact was immediate and devastating. This wasn't David's interpretation of events or Sarah's victimization narrative. This was Bob Thompson himself, in his own words, describing the family dynamics that had driven his youngest daughter away. Bob made 47 of these recordings, David announced. 47 conversations where he talked about his pride in Sarah, his frustration with the family situation, and his determination to find a way to bridge the gap that had developed. Not once in 47 conversations did he express disappointment in Sarah's choices or regret about her success. Not once did he suggest that she was the problem. My mother sank back into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. The righteous anger that had fueled her public confrontation was crumbling in the face of evidence that contradicted everything she had convinced herself was true. But Jessica wasn't ready to give up. "Those recordings don't prove anything," she said desperately. Of course he was going to say nice things about Sarah to her husband. Of course he was going to make himself look good in conversations that he knew were being recorded. David's expression hardened, and he reached into his other pocket, pulling out a thick folder of what looked like printed emails and text messages. "You're right that the recordings only show one side," he said. "So let's look at the written record too." Bob forwarded me every email, every text message, every piece of communication he had with family members about Sarah over the last 2 years. "Should we read some of those too?" The folder looked substantial, and the implication was clear. My father hadn't just been talking to David about the family situation. He had been documenting it, building a comprehensive record of exactly what had been said and done to push me away from family gatherings. Frank Rodriguez stood up again, clearly ready to take control of a situation that was spiraling beyond what anyone had anticipated. "I think," he said firmly, "that we've heard enough. Bob asked me to read his letter because he wanted the truth to be known, but I don't think he intended for his funeral to become a courtroom where people had to defend themselves against evidence." But the VAR's damage was already done. The carefully constructed narrative that my mother and Jessica had built around my absence from family life had been systematically dismantled in front of everyone who mattered in their social circle. The people who had been prepared to judge me for abandoning my family were now looking at my mother and sister with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disapproval. Mrs. Peterson from the grocery store stood up, her face flushed with anger. "Linda Thompson," she said, her voice shaking, "I am ashamed of you. That man worked himself into an early grave trying to fix what you and Jessica broke, and you have the nerve to stand here at his funeral and blame everyone but yourselves." Other voices began to join hers. People who had known our family for years, who had watched the dynamics play out in small ways over time, were finally feeling free to speak their minds about what they had observed. "I always wondered why Sarah stopped coming around," said Tom Riley from the post office. "Now I understand. You made that girl feel unwelcome in her own family." "Bob was so proud of her," added Martha Hendricks from the bank. "Every time he came in, he had some new story about her business or something she had designed. He never stopped talking about how smart she was, how hard she worked. I should have realized something was wrong when she stopped coming home." The tide of public opinion was turning decisively, and my mother seemed to recognize that her attempt to control the narrative had backfired spectacularly. She looked around the room at faces that had once been friendly and supportive, now reflecting judgment and disappointment, and I could see the moment when she realized that her standing in the community had been fundamentally damaged by her own words. But it was Michael who delivered the final blow to any remaining credibility my mother and Jessica might have had. My baby brother, who had been sitting quietly through the entire confrontation, finally stood up and walked to the front of the room. "Mom," he said, his voice carrying a sadness that seemed to age him beyond his 26 years. "I need to say something, and I need everyone to hear it." Linda Thompson looked at her son with a mixture of hope and apprehension, clearly unsure whether he was going to support her version of events or add to her humiliation. "Sarah never made me feel bad about not having a college degree," Michael said, addressing the room rather than our mother directly. "Sarah never looked down on me or judged me or made me feel like a failure. The only person who ever made me feel like a failure was you, Mom. You're the one who constantly compared me to my sisters, who made it clear that I was the disappointment of the family." The pain in his voice was evident to everyone listening, and I felt my heart breaking for the brother I had lost touch with somewhere along the way. Michael had always been caught in the middle of our family's dysfunction, used as a weapon in arguments he never wanted to be part of. And you know what else? Michael continued, his voice growing stronger. Sarah tried to help me. 2 years ago, when she offered to help Jessica with her marketing, she also offered to help me put together a resume and look for better job opportunities. I was the one who turned her down because I was embarrassed about needing help. I was the one who let pride get in the way of accepting assistance from my sister, who had figured out how to be successful. He turned to look at me directly for the first time in years, and I could see tears in his eyes. I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm sorry I let them convince me that you thought you were better than us. I'm sorry I didn't stand up for you when you needed someone to. And I'm sorry it took Dad's death for me to find the courage to tell the truth about what this family really became. The room was completely silent now, the weight of Michael's words settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. This wasn't just about my relationship with my parents anymore. This was about a fundamental breakdown in family relationships that had affected everyone, even the people who were supposed to be the beneficiaries of the favoritism and protection. David put his arm around my shoulders and guided me toward the casket where my father lay. The crowd parted to let us through, and I could feel the shift in energy as people moved from being witnesses to a family drama to being mourners at a funeral again. Say goodbye to your dad, Sarah, David whispered in my ear. Say everything you need to say, because after today, everything changes. I placed my hand on the smooth wood of the casket, feeling the finality of it beneath my palm. Thank you, Daddy, I whispered, not caring who heard me. Thank you for loving me enough to fight for me, even when I didn't know you were fighting. Thank you for seeing who I really was, and for making sure everyone else would see it too. The walk out of Peaceful Rest Funeral Home felt like the longest journey of my life. David's hand in mine was steady and warm, anchoring me as we moved through the crowd of people who were no longer looking at me with judgment or curiosity, but with respect and something that might have been admiration. As we reached the door, Frank Rodriguez caught up with us, his weathered face creased with satisfaction and sadness in equal measure. Your father would be proud of how you handled yourself in there, he said. He knew it was going to be difficult, but he also knew you were strong enough to get through it. Outside, the rain had stopped, and weak October sunlight was breaking through the clouds for the first time all day. The parking lot was full of people saying their goodbyes, making plans to attend the graveside service, discussing the scholarships and what they might mean for future generations of Riverside students. But I wasn't going to the graveside service. The public part of my goodbye to my father was complete, and the private grief that remained was something that needed to be processed away from the complicated dynamics of family and community expectations. David seemed to understand without being told. He opened the car door for me, and as I settled into the passenger seat, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not happiness, not relief, but a deep, quiet peace that came from finally understanding that I had been loved completely and unconditionally by the person whose opinion mattered most. The trust fund would help other young people escape the limitations of small-town thinking. The recordings and documents would ensure that the truth about our family dynamics was preserved for anyone who might question it in the future. But the most important gift my father had given me was the knowledge that I had never been the problem, never been the disappointment, never been anything other than exactly what he had hoped I would become. As we drove away from Peaceful Rest Funeral Home, leaving behind the complicated mess of family relationships and community judgment, I realized that my father had given me one final lesson in how to love someone completely. You fight for them, you sacrifice for them, and you make sure they know that your pride in them is stronger than anyone else's disapproval. The Robert James Thompson Educational Trust would be my father's lasting legacy to the community, but his lasting legacy to me was simpler and more profound. The absolute certainty that I was loved exactly as I was, exactly as I had chosen to become, exactly as I would continue to be. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.